Last time we spoke about the final days of the First Sino-Japanese War, the invasion of the Pescador Islands, Taiwan, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The Japanese had taken Port Arthur, Wei Highway, and they were on the verge of marching upon Beijing. The Qing were slow to action on the negotiation front, leading to 3 attempts to reach a peace agreement. However, in the meantime, the Japanese prolonged things for just enough time to allow their amphibious forces to invade the Pescador Islands and Taiwan. Li Hangzhang became the scapegoat for the entire conflict, and he was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Shimonoseki. However, in the end, it would also be Japan getting served a nasty deal because of the triple intervention on behalf of Germany, France, and Russia. The balance of power in the East had dramatically changed, and with change comes movement. The movement of many people all over the world. This episode is Overseas Chinese during the 19th century. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Maybe you're into some visual stuff. Over there I have a 2-part series on the First Sino-Japanese War. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And a big thank you to everybody who's already joined up. You guys are awesome. At the moment, there's a bit of a vote for what will be the next exclusive podcast over there, but it's looking like it might be on a very bizarre story about a Japanese official who tried to create Israel in Shanghai. So if you want to check that out, go over to the Patreon. Now I want to start off by saying I did not know when I was going to tackle this subject, but I figured after the First Sino-Japanese War would be a good place. The 1890s is sort of a odd window of time for China, where a lot of things change. When I was doing my undergraduate degree in history, a requirement for my university was that you had to take a certain amount of courses in specific fields of history. One was Canadian history, as I am from Quebec, so it was kind of just, forced upon you. In one of those courses, I had to spend an extensive amount of time learning about the Chinese-Canadian experience, particularly during the end half of the 19th century. Now, I know the majority of you listeners are American and probably know the general history of Chinese immigration to America during the 19th century. For Canada, it's, to be honest, quite similar. First thing that comes to mind to all of you, I imagine, is the railroad building. It's a fundamental part of both America and Canada's history, the building of some of the great railroads, and unfortunately, the terrible mistreatment of Asian immigrants. In this episode, however, I don't want to talk just about Canada and the United States, because in truth, Chinese immigration during the 19th century saw Chinese going to all sorts of different nations, for various reasons too. I wanted to keep this episode within the 19th century as well because, I will probably do another episode further down the road about what it's like for overseas Chinese during the 20th century, which is an entirely different story. But also, keeping it within the 19th century, I think you'll find that the story about the movement of the Chinese immigrants actually has a lot to do with all of the events we've been speaking about. So let's just jump into it. There are more than 50 million overseas Chinese today. Most of them are in Southeast Asia, in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, and such. They represent one of the highest figures of immigration in the entire world. Their migration goes back to ancient times, roughly 2,000 years ago during the opening of the Maritime Silk Road. Chinese immigrants were moving mainly to Southeast Asia. When the 15th century came around, the Chinese began moving to places like Sumatra and Java, establishing what we call today Chinatowns. Where trade went, so did the Chinese, and by the 16th century, trade began to pick up with Europe. Europeans began to establish themselves in the Far East, looking to trade, and in the process they integrated numerous places within a world trade network. European powers began to compete with another to expand and develop colonies in places like Southeast Asia, and this in turn increased a demand for Chinese merchants and laborers. When the 17th century rolled around, there was an estimated 100,000 or so Chinese scattered about Southeast Asia, and 20 to 30,000 perhaps in Japan. Many Chinese came over during the Wokou years, setting up bases in Japan to help raid mainland China as pirates. When the Manchu conquered the Qing Dynasty, numerous Chinese refugees fled to Japan to escape Manchu rule. Now, it's during the 19th century when we really begin to see massive movements to the far reaches of the globe. When the so-called age of colonialism was at its height, so too would the Chinese immigration be at its height, and with it a diaspora began. By the starting of the 19th century, millions of Chinese pulled up stakes and left for unfamiliar and faraway places. You might be asking why. During the final century of the Qing Dynasty, China began to struggle with mounting challenges, as I think we have seen during this series. These problems were both internal and external in nature. Internally, the Qing had doubled their territory, incorporating areas in the north and west which were sparsely populated, adding ethnic and religious diversity to the empire. There were Manchu, Hans, Mongolians, Tibetans, Muslims, and such. Alongside this, the population exploded because of new irrigation systems and water management techniques that were helping tackle China's most troublesome historic nemesis, floods and droughts. New crops had come over from the Americas, such as corn, sweet potatoes, and peanuts. The new foodstuffs could be grown in areas of China that historically always had trouble growing stuff, allowing for new lands to be expanded upon, such as the southwest and northeast. As the nutrition improved, China's population exploded. By 1740, the Qing dynasty numbered 140 million. By 1850, this increased to a whopping 430 million people. Population growth holds numerous benefits to a nation, such as increasing economic activity, but it can also cause great strain. China took a very long time to industrialize, I think, as we all know. In the early half of the 1800s, most Chinese supported themselves through farming, but with the population booming, less and less land pushed more and more to find new lands. The Qing government, meanwhile, as we have seen in this series countless times, proceeded to become incredibly corrupt. Their officials neglected the common people and engaged in corruption purely to enrich themselves, and they gradually became more and more inept at governance. I honestly feel like I'm like Ron Swanson or something, always complaining about the Chinese government during the 19th century. Taxation is theft, people, always remember that. With a corrupt government and a booming population of dissatisfied people, 19th century China was ripe for conflict. The first major one was the White Lotus Rebellion of 1796 to 1804. It broke out in response to famine, overcrowding of land, and from the harassment by corrupt Qing officials. The cult lashed out, resulting in the deaths of possibly millions of people, and costing the Qing dynasty nearly 100 million taels. Then the First Opium War broke out against Britain, resulting in a humiliating defeat and the beginning of unequal treaties forced upon China. After this, the worst civil war in human history, the Taiping Rebellion, broke out yet again during a time of famine, with another cult, mind you, and the Taiping, led by Hong Xiuquan, had nearly toppled the Qing dynasty, leading to the death of over 20 million people or so. And alongside the Taiping Rebellion was the Nian Rebellion and the Second Opium War, inviting more death and humiliating treaties tossed upon China. The Dungan Revolt killed another 10 or so million people, causing countless Hui Muslims to flee into surrounding neighboring states. I am by no means mentioning all the conflicts of the 19th century, but the turmoil of the 19th century caused terrible suffering on the people of China, whether it be from drought, famine, war, governmental harassment, or simple incompetence. And when this becomes your everyday life, what do you do to improve it? Well, after witnessing foreign barbarians nearly toppling your government multiple times, showcasing technologies you've never seen before, you might get curious, well, what is it like where they live? Once the bans were lifted, Christian missionaries were pouring into China from many of these nations. These people did not simply sail over to China either. In the mid-19th century, the invention of steamships made sea crossing much faster and safer. With steamships came railroads, a much more efficient way to move raw materials and people across land. Steamships and railroads would have a profound effect on China. The construction of railroads required a lot of work, particularly dangerous work, of clearing land and laying tracks. European colonies, the Americas, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and other far-reaching places had enormous demands for labor, whether it be in construction, agriculture, mining, railroad building, etc., etc. Plantations for rice, rubber, fruit, sugar, tea, hell, mining of guano was huge. And talk about a shitty job. Like we see today, companies sought cheap and exploitable pools of labor to fit their demands. Many of them turned to China. China, because of the Opium Wars and later the First Sino-Japanese War, had opened up countless treaty ports. She was burst open. Now, there were fundamentally two rationales for Chinese migration. The first being flight, and the second economic. Flight refers to those literally driven to flee, where they were because of war, famine, disease, natural disasters, terrible government, and persecution. The economic refers to the drive to just improve one's life. Maybe the grass is greener on the other side, as they say. Both of these rationales could lead to temporary or permanent moves, and it did not necessarily mean leaving China either. Let's not forget a ton of internal moving was occurring. Take during the Taiping Rebellion. As the violence escalated, countless people had to flee for their lives. Take the example of the wealthy class. Wherever the Taiping entered, any area, obviously these people feared losing everything as the Taiping confiscated all wealth. Therefore, countless fled to newly opened treaty ports like Shanghai, where foreign protection could be found. They began dealing with foreigners, and they discovered some mutual interests. This was a large reason why places like Shanghai and Hong Kong were transformed into booming, sophisticated cities. But for the countless common people, the Taiping-Qing War saw a large mobile population wandering wherever seemed safe at any given time. Many of these people fled to provinces in the southwest and southeast. When the war ended, major food and tax-producing provinces were depopulated. Take Jiangsu, for example, which saw 70% of its population of around 24 million people leave. Anhui and Zhejiang lost around 50% of their respective 15 million people or so. When the war was finally over, the flight of migrants did not all return. Hubei, Hunan, Henan saw a ton of their people simply pack up and set up shop east. A lot of people also fled into Manchuria, which had always been sparsely populated, even though it was one of the richest areas for agriculture and natural resources. The Qing had always limited migration to Manchuria, trying to protect the Manchu homelands, but beginning in the 1860s, the Qing leadership had a, let's say, change of heart. There were two major reasons for this. Number one, the Taiping Rebellion had ravaged the governmental budget, and prosperous agricultural regions that provided a ton of tax revenue were depopulated. China had indemnity payments to pay to, let's say, the British and French, and money was needed to be made. So the Qing began selling land in Manchuria and made sure to increase taxes upon it once the people who moved there became productive. The second reason was Russia. Russia was encroaching into Manchuria, and the Qing worried its sparse population would leave it vulnerable, so they opened the doors to Han Chinese to help them out. Now, it was not just the Russian encroaching into Manchuria, there was also the Japanese, who had always had their eyes on the region. As I explained briefly towards the end of the last episode, the Russians basically swindled the Japanese with a triple intervention, managing to seize a 25-year lease over the Liaodong Peninsula in 1898. The Russians quickly went to work developing the region's agriculture, mining, and, crucially, its railways. All of this required the pumping of money into Manchuria, further building up a desire for Chinese migration to fill the large demand. Now, this is all internal movements. What about the external? Millions of Chinese responded to the international demand for labor during the mid to late 19th century, taking them first to Southeast Asia, and then to all corners of the known world. The major reason they were able to do this in large scale was because of steamship technology and the increase of foreigners inside China telling them about the various nations they came from. The majority of early migration came from the wealthy class, who sought to move their families and businesses abroad. These types of businesses were typically laundromats, stores, restaurants, and such. They mostly came from Guangdong and Fujian, as southern China was in turmoil due to the opium trade and the Taiping Rebellion. Southern China had become fertile grounds for Western companies to come over and recruit. The British picked up the Chinese and brought them to build up their colonies in Malaya and Singapore, while the Dutch would bring them over to places like Sumatra. They worked in sweltering hot plantations for tea, rubber, rice, fruit, and the great tin mines of Malaya. This all, of course, becomes quite dark. I briefly talked about the, quote, pig trade, the pigs being Chinese coolies who were either hired or kidnapped into indentured servitude overseas. Britain had outlawed slavery in 1807, but the experience for these poor souls would be very reminiscent of Western African slaves. The term Shanghaied comes from this time, when Chinese were sometimes drugged up or boozed up, tossed onto ships going to various places like Trinidad, British Honduras, Jamaica, New South Wales, British Guyana, Peru, Cuba, honestly all over. Now, the pig trade was quite reviled. Take this passage from 1852 by the Foreign Secretary Lord Malmesbury. Inequities scarcely exceeding those practiced on the African coast and on the African Middle Passage have not been wanting. The jails of China have been emptied to supply labor to British colonies. Hundreds of coolies gathered together in barracoons, stripped naked and stamped or painted with the letter C, California, P, Peru, or S, Sandwich Islands, on their breasts according to destination. It was actually the gradual abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery itself that rose the demand for Chinese coolies. The British were the pioneers on this front, sending 200 Chinese laborers over to Trinidad in 1806 to, quote, in an attempt to establish a settlement of free peasant cultivators and laborers. These initial shipments saw Chinese on vessels that had literally been used to transport African slaves in the previous years. The Trinidad experiment failed. Only 20 to 30 of the 200 Chinese remained on the island by the 1820s. However, such stories inspired people like Sir John Gladstone to bring Chinese over to sugar plantations in British Guyana in the hopes of replacing the lost Afro-Caribbean workforce because the slave trade was coming to an end. Now, the logistics of coolie labor were murky to say the least. Most in theory were under contract, paid to be temporary. One would say it was consensual. Regardless, many in Britain rightfully saw how horrible it was, and they tried to fight to end the trade or at least improve conditions for the Chinese coolies. Many of these humane reformers argued the Chinese would be tricked into signing employment contracts based on misleading promises, often kidnapped or even sold by coolie merchants within China. And there was a ton of truth to this. Most of these unfortunate men had debts, like gambling debts, and their lenders simply sold them off. But there were also many men who volunteered, because they were offered free passage and paid something like 20 cents per day. While I have been focusing on the British, everyone was in the game somewhat. Take, for example, the Portuguese who held Macau, which was the center of the coolie trade. It was said from 1848 to 1873, Macau's only real business was trading coolie slaves. And eventually it became so bad, the British forced them to ban it. Spain sent Cuba 2 large shipments of Chinese coolies in 1847 to work the sugar fields in Havana. These men came from Xiamen, one of the treaty ports that opened up after the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. When Guangdong opened up, Peru saw a ton of Chinese coolies come over to work in their silver mines and in the guano cultivation industry. When their contracts were up, many of the Chinese well, they integrated into the countries of Peru, let's say, or the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Before 1959, when the Cuban Revolution broke out, Havana held Latin America's largest Chinatown, a result purely of the coolie trade. South America saw around 100,000 Chinese indentured laborers come over between 1850 and the late 1870s. The most vulnerable would be those poor souls deceived by false contracts or kidnapped, who saw themselves basically thrown into slavery. For the majority who went to Cuba and Peru, this was unfortunately the case. After a 4-month grueling journey crammed onto a ship like a sardine, they would arrive to be met with cruelty and abuse. Most would find their contracts were written in such a way that it would be nearly impossible for them to ever repay the cost of their passage, which was not covered for in this case. Also housing or food. When reports began to surface between 1847 and 1854 about the abuse of those going over to Cuba and Peru, Britain tried to take responsibility. They tried to close ports that were sending these people off to those places, such as Amoy. But this simply led to Macau becoming the largest coolie port in the end. Hell, some of these Chinese participated in the War of the Pacific, known also as the Saltpeter War, where they burned down many of the haciendas they worked for. 2,000 Chinese coolies joined a Chilean army in Peru helping the wounded and burying the dead. So these Chinese that had gone over to Latin America, they had an impact on the histories of many countries there. The Germans brought some over to German Samoa to work on their plantations, which only ended during World War I when Anzac forces seized the islands. The French shipped off Chinese coolies to Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guiana, the French West Indies, and such. This also involved Indian coolies, by the way. Oh yes, there is a horrible amount of stories about what happened to Indians. I can't possibly cover all the nations that overseas Chinese went to. It is global. They went all around the world. I just tried to cover the ones that saw large numbers. But the largest migration really began with the age of gold rushes. All around the world, large-scale gold rushes emerged in Oceania, Africa, South America, and North America. In Australia, the population tripled from 430,000 in 1851 to 1.7 million in 1871, making Australia the first multicultural society during the Gold Rush period. The Gold Rush began in May of 1851 after a prospector named Edward Hargraves claimed to have discovered gold in Ophir. Hargraves had been to California's goldfields learning gold prospecting techniques such as panning and cradling. Victoria would see the first large gold rush in July of 1851, and word spread fast. 290,000 people migrated to Victoria from British territories, 15,000 from European nations, 18,000 from the United States, but not all were welcome. In 1855, 11,493 Chinese arrived in Melbourne, which saw Victoria enact the Chinese Immigration Act of 1855 in response. This severely limited the number of Chinese passengers permitted on an arriving vessel. But to evade the new law, many Chinese began landing in southern parts of Australia, and they would hike it some 400 kilometers or so across the country to get to Victoria's goldfields. In 1865, Richard Daintree discovered the Cape River goldfield, which soon attracted Chinese to Queensland for the first time. In 1872, James Mulligan discovered gold in the Palmer River around Cooktown, seeing 3 years of waves upon waves of Chinese prospectors. By 1877, over 18,000 residents were Chinese miners. Now, I wanted to leave the United States and Canada for last if you were wondering, as I think they are probably the most well-known stories of Chinese immigration. So let's start with a very popular story, that of the Great Californian Gold Rush. In 1848, James W. Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. The news soon brought over 300,000 people to California. And while most of them were Americans, the gold rush also attracted thousands from Latin America, Oceania, Europe, and China. The Chinese began arriving in 1849. The first major rush was at Gumsan, nicknamed Gold Mountain by the newly arrived Chinese. In 1849, around 90,000 people had come over, of which around 50 to 60,000 were American. By 1852, 20,000 Chinese had landed in the San Francisco area. Their distinct dress and appearance made them particularly recognizable in the goldfields, and they were met with a ton of racism and violence. The American miners were frustrated with all the foreigners encroaching, and the Chinese were easier targets than, let's say, the European groups. Initially, the Chinese worked for themselves, or they labored with other miners, but the American miners began to press upon the government to thwart more Chinese from coming over. The California legislature passed a foreign miners license law in 1850, charging non-U.S. citizens $20 per month. The law would be repealed within a year because of how exorbitant the fees were, but this did not dissuade the Chinese who would go on to found America's first Chinatown in San Francisco, where by 1852 the Chinese now accounted for 30% of all immigrants. In response, the California legislature passed another foreign miners tax now at $4 per month. Many Chinese thrived during this time despite the hurdles that they had to face. Chinese mining companies like Zheng China Placer Mining Company and the Hong Kong China Wing Dam Company hired up to 20 workers and provided industrial equipment and expanded large-scale operations. Small-scale worker cooperatives amongst the Chinese also thrived in the 1850s, which operated similar to the larger companies, using a share risk system amongst the workers. Many Chinese also chose to work for wages from white employers. It is estimated, though it varies greatly, that Chinese miners were making around $39 to $50 a month, which would have been around the average wage for white miners at the time. But as you can imagine, there was much hardship, and the violence could get incredibly bad. Take for example what is known as the Hell's Canyon Massacre. In 1887, two groups of Chinese miners headed to Oregon's Hell's Canyon to search for gold. On May the 25th of 1887, 7 White Horse gang members, these were horse thieves, they robbed, murdered, and mutilated between 10 to 34 of the Chinese miners, who were all employees of the Samyup Company. It's said that they stole up to a possible $50,000 worth of gold. Historian David H. Stratton described the massacre as such. The brutality of the Snake River atrocity was probably unexcelled, whether by whites or Indians, in all the anti-Chinese violence of the American West. After the first day's onslaught at Robinson Gulch, the killers wrecked and burned the camp and they threw the mutilated corpses into the Snake River. The bodies of the other Chinese received similar treatment. Since it was the high water stage of the spring runoff, the dead Chinese were found for months. Some accounts say for years, afterwards along the lower river. On the 26th, more Chinese showed up to investigate the scene and 8 more were shot dead by the gang. Later on in 1888, one Frank Vaughn confessed to taking part in the crime, giving up the names of 6 of his associates. Most had departed America, save for Vaughn and another man named Hughes. Their gang leader, Bruce Evans, known as Old Blue, was blamed for everything, but he escaped custody. Now, by the 1860s, the gold rush was kind of quieting down, leaving many Chinese looking for work, and they found it in railway construction. The first major railway seeing Chinese workers was the first transcontinental railroad, which linked up California to the eastern United States. Construction began in 1863 with terminal points at Omaha, Nebraska, and Sacramento. Despite the gold rush raising California's population, a large number of Chinese were recruited in 1865 to help build up the railway. Many of these were former gold or silver miners, and it was Charles Crocker, a manager of the Central Pacific Railroad, who was one of the first trying to hire Chinese. As he pointed out to his colleagues, there were benefits to hiring Chinese over, let's say, whites, as they cost a third of the salary. Crocker also pointed out that they could just hire the Chinese immigrants to do some of the more grueling work, particularly the dangerous work. Crocker soon broke records for laying track, finishing the project 7 years ahead of time. He was able to do this pretty much because he was working the men down to the bones. The Central Pacific Track was constructed primarily by Chinese. Crocker initially hired every Chinese he could find in California, but soon he began importing Chinese workers directly from China. The railroad had to pass over rivers and through canyons, requiring bridges to be made and tunnels to be blown up. Many of the Chinese workers would be sent into said tunnels to break through using hand tools and black powder bombs. To tunnel through places like the foothills of Sierra Nevada, the Central Pacific began using a newly invented type of technology, a rather extremely unstable one, nitroglycerin explosives, aka TNT. This greatly accelerated the rate of construction and deaths for the poor Chinese workers who had to use them. The job often saw Chinese workers tossed into large baskets with said explosives going down into hard-to-reach areas. They would light the fuse, and then the people who were pulling down the basket would try to pull it up as fast as they can to get away from the blast area. Not a very safe thing to do. Over 11,000 Chinese took part in the project, and they made up 90% of the work effort. A large portion of them came from Guangdong, recruited through a network of small firms and labor contractors. It is estimated around 1,000 Chinese died building the Central Pacific Railroad. Now, as the Chinese came to the United States for the gold rush and then the railroad construction, they were met with a lot of racism, violence, and legislative efforts against them. I mentioned the American miners pushing for legislation against them, but when the Chinese began to work on the railways, well, this was greatly expanded upon. In the 1870s, various legal discriminatory measures were made against the Chinese. In San Francisco, Chinese schoolchildren from 1859 to 1870 were segregated. But in 1870, the requirement to educate them was simply dropped. Also in 1870, the Naturalization Act, which extended citizenship rights to African Americans, specifically barred Chinese on the grounds that they could not be assimilated into American society. Chinese immigrants were thus prohibited from voting, jury duty, which, let's be honest, was kind of a blessing, and faced alien land laws prohibiting them from purchasing property, establishing permanent homes, or businesses. In 1873, the Pigtail Ordinance, yes, you heard that right, targeted Qing Dynasty immigrants based on their coups. The law required prisoners in San Francisco to have their hair cut within an inch of their scalp, and any Qing citizens who went to prison had to have their coups cut off, which meant they could not go back home until they grew back. The law was passed with the idea it would dissuade Chinese immigration. 2 years later came the Page Act of 1875, barring Chinese women from entering the United States. This was justified under the guise many of them who came over were allegedly performing sex work. In reality, it was just another measure taken to dissuade Chinese immigration. This was followed up in 1882 by the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers. All of this was strongly driven by frustrated American workers who saw the Chinese as a threat to their jobs. It began with the miners, and then the railway workers, who pressed unions which pressed the legislatures to toss countless anti-Chinese laws trying to dissuade them from coming over to the United States. With so much discrimination and hurdles tossed at them, the Chinese began moving somewhere else to make ends meet. Chinese immigrants began arriving to the colony of Vancouver Island in the late 1850s looking for gold. The colony of British Columbia, much like California, was seeing a gold rush of its own. The first Chinese community was established in Barkerville, where half of its population were Chinese. Soon, other Chinatowns emerged in Richfield, Van Winkle, Quesnel-les-Mouth, Stanley, Atlery, and Quesnel, Forks. By 1860, the Chinese population of Vancouver Island and British Columbia was around 7,000. Then in 1871, British Columbia agreed to join the Confederation of Canada, and one of its conditions to do so was for the new federal government of Canada to build a railway linking BC to eastern Canada. So yes, it's basically the exact same type of situation as California with the eastern United States. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, along with numerous investors, realized the project would be unbelievably expensive. They also realized they could simply cut costs by employing Chinese laborers. As Macdonald told Parliament in 1882, "It is simply a question of alternatives. Either you must have this labor, or you can't have the railway." In 1880, Andrew Onderdonk, one of the main construction contractors in British Columbia for the new Canadian Pacific Railway, began recruiting Chinese laborers from California. Learning from the Americans, he also began importing Chinese workers from Guangdong and Taiwan. The Chinese workers were hired for the first 320 kilometers of the CPR, which was considered to be the most difficult and dangerous segments, particularly the parts going through Fraser Canyon. Like their American counterparts, they were paid much less than white Canadians, around 50% on the dollar. Between 1880 to 1885, 17,000 Chinese workers came to build the CPR, with around 700 or so dying due to the terrible work conditions. The CPR's construction resulted in the establishment of Chinatowns along the railway line, which further resulted in Chinese communities spreading across all of Canada. Following directly in the footsteps of the Americans, when the CPR was finished in 1884, the following year saw the infamous Chinese head tax. The Canadian government levied its first of many to come anti-Chinese immigration acts to discourage Chinese from coming to Canada. The head tax system stipulated all Chinese people entering Canada first had to pay $50, i.e., the head tax. This would be amended to $100 in 1900, $500 in 1903, and so forth. Because of this, basically no Chinese laborers could afford to bring over their families, though BC's Chinese communities still grew. In British Columbia, the people noticed all of these differing Asian groups coming into the province, as it was not just Chinese. Many Japanese, for example, came over particularly for the fishing industry. Well, they perceived these people to be taking their jobs. I can't help but think of that South Park episode with all the rednecks saying, "Taking our jobs." But you know what? In reality, it's a lot more complicated than that, because there is some legitimacy to the fact that they were taking said jobs. But they should have been blaming the heads of the companies doing this in the first place. When your boss is undercutting your entire province and their worker force for cheap labor, you should probably go after that boss. And this was by no means a unique feature of North America. Australia likewise had tossed up immigration restriction acts like the one in 1901, the infamous White Australia policy, which eliminated Asian immigration after their federation. Canada was just doing the same as everybody else. The Asian Exclusion League in Canada, and yes, there was a league just for this, who lobbied as much as they could to thwart Chinese immigration, well, they were kicking up a storm at the end half of the 19th century, and quite a lot during the beginning of the 20th. But for this episode, I actually did not want to dwell too much in the 20th century, because I'm probably going to do an episode later on to talk about it. But I would be remiss to not talk about one thing that happened in the 20th century. In 1907, the tension had increased in BC as more and more Asian immigrants were flooding over into BC from the United States as a result of all of their anti-Chinese regulations. It was kind of like a hot potato situation if you think about it. By the end of October of 1907, over 11,440 immigrants came over, and 8,125 of them were Japanese, 1,266 were Chinese, and Sikhs made up another 2,049. Anti-Asian acts were blowing up, and soon full-scale riots spread. The Asian Exclusion League developed a new immigration act, but the federal government refused to back it. This led to absolute outrage, which led to its members starting a parade on September the 7th of 1907. This parade turned quickly into a mob riot where Chinese and Japanese neighborhoods were attacked. Asian-owned businesses were vandalized, beer bottles were tossed at windows, fires were lit. The rioters were trying to destroy all the local Asian businesses. They came to Chinatown, where armed Japanese residents fought back. Over 50 stores had their windows broken in, and the entire riot only died down at around 3 a.m. Labor Minister Mackenzie King, yes, the soon-to-be Prime Minister of Canada, conducted a commission into the riots, finding the damage to be worth around $26,000 for the Chinese community and around $9,000 for the Japanese. The riot directly led to the 1908 Gentlemen's Agreement, one, I might add, not so many people know about. Not, let's say, as notably as the head tax. This was a secret agreement between Japan and Canada to restrict the number of passports issued to Japanese annually at under 400 peoples. So yes, BC saw years of absolute violence against the Asian communities, particularly the Japanese and the Chinese, and it was a very dark part of Canadian history. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Want to see something a bit different? I have done multiple history film reviews on films like The Last Samurai, The Opium War, When the Last Sword is Drawn, and much more. Check it out. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you get early access to all of my content, live hangouts, and of course, exclusive podcasts, like my 4-part series on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident, and the author behind the Final War theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. I do apologize if this episode was a bit more on the gloomy side, but do not forget that all of these Asian communities are thriving today all around the world. I plan to do another episode on overseas Chinese in the 20th century, so I hope you enjoyed this one and come back for some more.